We are ready for the second panel of the morning, which is a continuation of a discussion about towards the future. And where are our panelists? Are they going to sit out there and listen? Okay. Yeah, no, he's not. Amy will see to that. Amy's the enforcer. So we're going to hear from Bill Penwell, and then Rich Lehrer is going to serve as the discussant for his presentation. And then we're going to hear from John Behrens, and Katie McMillan Culp will discuss John's presentation. So I'll turn it over to Bill.
Thanks, Jim, and for the invitation to this meeting. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity. And I want to start also by acknowledging my co-author, Douglas Watkins from Denver Public Schools, who can't be here because of his day job back as the science curriculum coordinator for the school district. I'm going to talk about parts of a system of assessment to pick up where Scott was encouraging us. There are things that are in the background that I would also invite you to listen for here that could have been the foreground at a conference on usable evidence. One of them is the idea of working inside a research practice partnership. The work I'm going to be describing has taken place within an 11-year-old partnership. The other is an idea that Bob put on a slide, but is more central in his longer treatment of a use case. And the idea of a use case comes from the field of human-computer interaction, and it's a technique to improve the usability of designs. So I'm going to describe a couple of use cases of particular parts of our assessment system, but please know both of these, partnership and use cases, relate directly to this theme of what counts as usable evidence. So I want to start with a vision, because as Lori's saying, we have to start with what is the vision for learning. We're working within the next generation science standards, and my sentence-long version of what that vision is about is it's from moving from teaching students science ideas just in case they need to know them for future learning, to supporting students in figuring out scientific ideas through investigating phenomena and solving problems that connect to students' interests, experiences, and identities. So hopefully you see some markers of sociocultural learning. The format of these standards is what I would call practice-centered. Rich alluded to the idea that, and I think this is true of the framework, is that it doesn't just draw on cognitive science as a basis for new goals for learning. It draws on the field of science studies or science and technology studies. Studies of what scientists and engineers actually do. And so the architecture of the standards is very different. And they require us, in order to get at integrated knowledge, to really engage students with phenomena as a way to learn. And I've given an example from our evolution curriculum. This is a little girl, Addie, who suffered from MRSA. And that's the MRSA, it's a multi-resistant strain, resistant bacteria there. And this is the opening to our evolution unit, is did Addie get sick, and why are there more Addies today? And students learn about natural selection and adaptation through over multiple lessons, and they're able to, at the end of this, meet this particular standard around natural selection and adaptation. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Two terms from my title that I want to define, because these mean different things, and this term epistemic justice is relatively new. It comes out of philosophy, but I think they're very important for how we think about our work. So for us, equity is about informing and supporting the redistribution of educational opportunities both within and across science classrooms so that all students experience meaningful science teaching. And I draw on a paper by Vicki Hand and Chris Gutierrez and I about this within and across. When we think about equity, what does it look like inside the classroom, and then does everybody in, say, a system have access to that kind of instruction? And we need to have both in our focus. With respect to epistemic justice, I mentioned this idea comes out of philosophy, but it's also something kids experience every day in K-12 education, that they are not knowers. And a lot of times the who is not a knower is tied to issues of gender and race in classrooms. And so we really think about epistemic justice as a goal of both supporting and repairing their perceptions of themselves as having agency as a knower and reasoner in their classrooms and in their communities. Our partnership's aim, just to make that concrete, because this is guiding our assessment system right now as an aim, is that 80% of the schools that opt into central office services, and there's a reason for that construction I won't go into, will have one teacher whose students' sense of belonging, contribution to knowledge building in the classroom, and identification with science and engineering cannot be predicted by their race or gender. So we'll unpack that a little bit more in terms of how we're measuring that. I mentioned that this is a partnership that's 11 years. The members include, importantly, research teams in computer science and in education from both the University of Colorado and at Northwestern University, a professional development provider, the Next Gen Science Exemplar Systems that works across the country with states and districts, Denver Public Schools, and BSCS, which is a curriculum developer, and Project Voice, which is a community-based youth organization focused on youth participatory action research. So those are our key partners. The use cases I want to present today are examples from our attempt to develop a system of assessments organized around principles of sociocultural theories. So this is looking to the future, but I want to emphasize these elements are actually in place in the district. This is not a pipe dream, and it's trying to get at sort of where Bob doesn't quite want to go. We're going through the classroom lens, though. So this is definitely, we're not trying to fix large-scale assessment with this problem. So we're using these three-dimensional assessments that have been alluded to in the earlier presentations this morning for summative tasks, but we also are using a set of assessment strategies for eliciting and making use of student interests and supporting the development of their practice-linked identities. And for those, the use cases have three elements that are typical in a use case in HCI as a discipline. So we talk about a success scenario and also an anticipated failure conditions and how we would actually deal with those. So I'm going to briefly, the chapter goes into those, and I'll briefly talk about them here today. I'm going to flash on two slides that shows you the whole system. At the center is a representation of a sequence of our curriculum. The curriculum sits at the center. We always have, both every day and overarching for units, a driving question, phenomena that students investigate, and through engaging in science practices to figure out some core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. On the right-hand side are what we would call the 3D type assessments. We have students at the end of the unit. They would build a model of why Addie got sick and why there are more Addies today, for example. They would also apply that to designing a solution to a problem, creating an infographic for their school community health clinic in this unit's case, where they have to explain why people should follow the CDC guidelines for using antibiotics. But what I want to talk about are the things on the left in the purple that really have to do with the sociocultural elements, the identity and interest related elements. A driving questions board which captures students' questions, exit tickets that we use, and also a move within the initial lesson for eliciting related phenomena from kids' everyday lives. Importantly, this system exists with a system of supports around it. You cannot implement one of these new systems without a whole set of systems that, other things that articulate with the district infrastructure. And I'll just say one example of that is that we have these rubrics that are tied to the student learning objectives, which are probably familiar to many of you in the room. So one of the things that our teachers built is something that articulates with how can I develop evidence that I need for my own performance evaluation that comes directly from the curriculum and is aligned to it and has a rubric for it. One of the ways that we really try to be student-centered in our work is through the curriculum itself. And this is an approach developed by my colleagues at Northwestern, led by Brian Reiser, called the storylines. And you can find these curriculum, they're OER curriculum materials. But one of the things we do in our co-design with teachers is we have a phenomenon, and then we try to anticipate what are kids' questions going to be. And through an iterative design process over multiple years, we get a good sense of when you throw up the video from Frontline of Addie and her sickness, what are the things that they're going to come, and how do we actually make sure that kids are also going to learn the core ideas while they do that? So that's a key tool, our first tool for really helping make curriculum seem coherent from the student point of view. They know why they're going to do what they're doing next because they've already come up with this as a question the class needs to answer. So how do we even make that happen in a really nice structured way so that it's pretty reliable, but also gets kids' own ideas, allows for there to be some novelty to the storyline that we haven't anticipated? Is we have something called an anchoring phenomenon routine. And I want to call this, we call it a teaching routine, but I want to call out it as an assessment opportunity too. So when we explore the anchoring phenomena, kids either look at a piece of data, they might watch a video, they might watch a demo, they might do an explanation or do an investigation, and they generate some noticings and wonderings about that. We also have them, before they've ever been taught anything, develop a model of the phenomena, an explanatory model. We know they don't have the pieces right for that. They generate some more questions. We also then say, what in your own life experience helps you prepare for this? Do you know people who've been sick like Addie? And inevitably in a classroom, yes, there's kids who have experienced things. Every kid's have had their families take antibiotics. Okay, well, what's your experience with that? And then we create something called a driving question board, which is a record, a public record that stays up for the whole unit, that is a record of the students' questions. All of those moments, especially of, for example, getting initial ideas, that tells you where the kids are beginning in terms of their understanding of natural selection, for example. The related phenomena create students as resources, as knowers in the classroom who might be able to help the class make progress on some of these questions already based on what they're bringing to the class. And that driving question board creates a sense of public accountability of the whole class to answering a set of questions throughout the unit. So that's one. So this is sort of in our success case scenario. I've just gone over some of these things, but I want to focus a little bit on the failure conditions. Because these things happen, and this is one of the things that we want to try to anticipate. So what happens if most of the student questions that they come up with is unrelated to what we've written about? Because we're curriculum writers, we have to worry about that. A second problem is that some of these questions could take students on long detours. Teachers are always worried about this from the planned route. And then the other thing that I think really could undercut this idea of epistemic justice is, what if we generate this board and it never gets returned to again? It's like the beginning and then it's left. So how do we actually address with those? One of the things is we have another assessment that I consider an assessment prior that informs the whole design, is we conduct a student interest survey. We have a range of candidate phenomena that they could anchor the unit that we're convinced addresses the content. And so we have a student survey for that. And we use that information about student interests to help us do that. Before those developing the storylines, I mentioned we actually implement the routine with different groups of teachers. And it turns out teachers and students come up with the same kinds of questions. Teachers don't believe their kids a lot of times can do that, but in fact they do. And so it increases our reliability or trust that we're going to come up with things. We can also think about how to make detours be part of opportunities for differentiation. And finally, one of the things that what we've done is to develop a routine in the classroom where responsibility for returning to the driving question board is shared by the class. And so some teachers are trying this out now, so that it's not just the teacher and their decision about, do I ever come back to this again, but it's actually something that the students come back to and can co-lead. The second example of an assessment that we're working on is called the Student Electronic Exit Ticket, or the SEAT. And this is the way we try to hold ourselves to account and measure that progress towards our partnership aim. And it includes a set of questions about the relevance of the day's lesson to students personally and to their community, the coherence of the lesson from their standpoint. Do they know why they were doing what they were doing that day and how it contributed to answering the overall question? And also the degree to which they contributed and felt that their contributions mattered to the flow of the class. These are two questions that we've done. done. And as a little bit of an advertisement for another paper on assessment arguments, you can find on learndbir.org a paper on what it means to develop a validity argument for this kind of assessment. We've got some work on that. And just to get a sense of the kind of thing that this reveals, and we published on this before, and this link, I assume these presentations will be available to everybody. This link is actually active. You can see the whole questions. Is just to see, you know, what percentage of kids are seeing a connection to the day's lesson? Which of them, what percent is it personally relevant to them or relevant to their communities? And we can also look at that and how that varies by teacher, and boy, it really does. So we can begin to also look at what are the teaching moves that help us understand differences in patterns to these responses. The way we're using, and now this is where I bump up, this is a classroom assessment, though, that I mentioned. We're trying to use it as a partnership. We're using it formatively to help us allocate resources for professional development to try to improve the implementation of the curriculum. So in this case, what we're hoping is that the teacher actually asks students, they would take out their phones or computers and complete this brief survey of their experience. These take 3 or 4 minutes to take. After 3 or 4 of these tickets, researchers would perform some analysis looking on the variation both within and across classrooms with respect to coherence, relevance, and student contribution. That would be disaggregated by race and gender, given our goals, for example. And then the researchers, our PD providers, and the district leaders, we would discuss the overall patterns in those data together and design learning experience that need attention. And that would be used to guide those experiences. So what are some failure conditions? And these are real. These are not just hypothetical. So some teachers lack the technology to be able to do so, to use these. Others have to be convinced that this kind of data is even valuable. They're used to the sort of multiple choice exit tickets that they give on content. So convincing them that they should care at this level to know the answer of how their kids experience is not, it's a hard sell for some teachers. The data we don't want and that we're worried about and have to think about is we don't want this to become part of the teacher evaluation system. This is for our partnership. But there's always a risk, because this is what happens to assessments that live at a district level, is that somebody wants to use them for accountability. And then they lose some of, I think, their learning focus. So how do we handle some of these? We've provided some alternative ways for gathering data. All of our exit tickets now exist within Illuminate, which is the system that the district bought for administering assessments and supporting teacher grading. We include questions on the survey that also provide evidence related to content in order to sort of entice teachers to maybe a little bit more reluctant to use them. And, you know, one of the things that we're in the middle of doing is creating more data agreements with the district regarding what kinds of analyses can be performed, which is a kind of standard practice in a research practice partnership, is really being clear about the kind of analyses you'll run. So I'll issue some caveats here with this. We exist within a relatively protected niche within our school district. Our superintendent has a very different theory of action about how to improve schools that has nothing to do with curriculum, for example. But we live within that and survive and do pretty well within the science curriculum. The view from the standpoint of teachers about the coherence of this curriculum, even though we're working to make it really coherent for them, they don't always see that coherence, because coherence is in the eyes of the beholder always. And I think this goal of equitable implementation remains really elusive for us. We still see huge variability across teachers. And I think for us, it's really important as a partnership to monitor all that. But what do these cases show? And I want to argue that they do show something about the possibility of developing a whole system of assessments that are grounded in sociocultural learning theory. And also the power, I think, for us as a partnership, this is less in the paper, and I more have to sort of convey what it feels like to be in the partnership, is that equity and epistemic justice are constructs. These are not just academic terms. We actually talk about them in the partnership, and they guide what we're doing, and I think in pretty meaningful ways in helping us to really sort of motivate the work. And I think, though, at the same time, we have to really keep our eyes on all these failure conditions. I forgot to put the link on the presentation, but you can see some of the types of assessments at this little, there's a tiny URL called 5 Types of CLA, and I'll ask to acknowledge especially Sarah Michaels and Jean Moon for their bringing especially the term epistemic justice to our work and really helping us as with a lens for that. So. I'm not sure how you get yours up. This way?
So my wife wanted to know why I was so happy while I was reading these papers, and I think you can see why now. I think there's something that Bill hasn't stressed also going on here. Yesterday we talked about the arduous task of creating learning progressions. But in fact, I think I've seen ways to speed this process up considerably and to expand it in some important ways. So I think I'd like to call that out too. So first we have this expanded view of learning ecology, and this is laid out nicely in Bill's chapter. So I'll just not add to that, but just to point to it. I like the role here of assessment bridging community and individual, and especially questions as sites of agency. So I wondered, as I was reading, I wanted to hear more about how the teacher innovations for supporting unanticipated questions, how are they shared and preserved in the community? I'd like to know more about what the history of innovation looks like how did these things emerge and develop? And then if we look at the students, I'd like to know a little bit more about change over time in student questions. I was pointing to something from a study that Bill cites on student agency and aesthetic. In this study, children were studying aquatic ecosystems for a prolonged period of time, and they were, of course, coming up with questions about the system. And initially, their questions, well, it was good to begin. It was like, at least questions were things that they didn't already know the answers to, and we thought that was good, and they were understandable. But we noticed a shift over time toward a more collective view of question. And of course, from a practice view, this is very important, because we frame questions in science in anticipation of critique of their groundings. And so I wonder if you have data like these, I think it might be also an interesting form of input to the system and also of assessment. I liked very much the emphasis that Bill just mentioned on modeling as a central practice, and then I know that he was focusing more on some of these other issues. But I wanted to know more about this relationship between models and questions. So, what's the wellspring when students change their questions? And I imagine it has a lot to do with the modeling activity, so that there probably are interesting forms of interaction. If you could just clarify that a little bit in your chapter, I think that would be very helpful. And I'd like to know more about this, the interaction, the inside of some of the classrooms. What does model critique look like? And what happens? And imagine that's also connected to this change in questions. The practical measure of questioning. I thought this was a really nice innovation, and this tradition of practical measure. And one thing that I wondered about, though, as I tried to position myself as a teacher on the other end of this, and I noticed that the researchers are doing the aggregations, and that they Is it right that it's about once a semester when you, yeah. So I wondered about whether or not part of the resistance of teachers, some teachers, and failing to see what use this was that it really wasn't very timely. It was almost like having another large-scale assessment that you heard about many months later. So I know that you're revising this, but I just wondered if you had considered ways of making this more timely for the teachers. I did have questions about formative assessment, but I know that maybe this just isn't the place to get at that. But I just wondered if in your chapter you could make some comments about the use in the system-wide innovation. Last, we often hear about student identity, and I think that, yes, we can get at some of this through surveys, but I think we can get much more out of watching students in practice. And so I wondered if you had given any thought to looking at student identity in terms of transitions in their histories of participation, their dispositions, because do I understand this extends over the year? So what happens over longer periods of time? So I think there's an implicit theory of development in the work, and if you could elevate that implicit theory and make it a little bit more explicit in terms of these sociocultural categories and theoretical entities. Thanks.
Okay, I lead an advanced computing team, but I have no idea what I'm supposed to do right now. Oh, I'll get rid of that. And there, yeah, 6, thanks. Thank you. My goal for the talk is just to be better than Bob was at the next forward arrow. So just a couple preliminary things. My co-authors are Kristen DeCerbo and Peter Foltz. Kristen does lots of wonderful things, and many of them in the area of game and simulation-based assessment. Peter does many wonderful things, and many in the area of automated scoring and cognition and language. We all work for Pearson. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the University of Notre Dame, where I have an adjunct assistant research professorship, and Peter would like to acknowledge the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he's a research professor in the Institute of Cognitive Sciences. Apologies to Katie for getting the paper so late to her. She's been super gracious. And somebody put on their paper it was preliminary and incomplete, and I thought that that was great, and we're going to use that too. We're going to do, I'm going to go over 5 ideas. Deprogram the testing part of your brain, technology-enhanced assessment or assessment-enhanced technology, big data, big computing, and big inference in 1 or 2 slides. Hard truths and ways forward. But first, we're going to have some audience participation because the learning people say it's good. So for each one of these things that are going to pop up on the screen, I'm going to ask you whether it's a test or a game. You're going to raise your hand, okay? So this is an activity. You're going to tell me whether it's a test or a game. The show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Who thinks it's a test? Thank you, Bob. Who thinks it's a game? All right, test again, anybody? Oh, okay. Game? We're going to keep doing this till we, no, just kidding. All right. So you think you can dance? It's another show on TV. Test? Game? All right. The SAT or the GRE? Who thinks it's a test? Who thinks it's a game? All the ETS people said game. Just saying. Your life? Test? It's a game. This is like Baptists versus Taoists. Yeah. This question, test or a game? So what we want to call out here is this whole LCS thing that Bob was, LCS, is that it? After 15 years, we got new acronyms, thank you. The whole LCS thing about these are socially constructed constructs. These are ways we think about the different kinds of experiences. In a paper from a long time ago by some of my favorite authors, including me and Bob, we said a test is a system in which examinees engage in an artificial task defined by rules that results in quantifiable outcomes. And where we got this definition was actually from reworking Katie Salen's Rules of Play book, where she said a game is a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. So you can see the name of this paper was Structural, Functional, and Semiotic Symmetries Between Games and Assessments. So the idea there is that functionally there's lots of similarities, there's quantification, often there's things like points, there's feature detection, evidence identification, and so on and so forth. The meaning comes from the context and is constructed by both what the person brings, but what the society around it brings. So for the purposes of this talk, we want to be really clear that educational assessments, the process of characterizing learner attributes writ large, not just knowledge, skills, and abilities. When Bob and I started writing almost 18 years ago together, we would say knowledge, skills, and abilities, but we really, over time, came to think about, well, that's a very specific, highly specific idea about what we're trying to do in assessment. We really want to broaden it to the broader set of many kinds of constructs. And if you look at educational assessment writ large, like what happens in special education evaluation, for instance, sometimes there's also often, we talked about yesterday, neurological issues, or there might be neurological tests going on in some kind of situations. And that's really not about knowledge, skills, and abilities. It's really about attributes in general. It could be social skills, could be personality issues as well. So let's think about education, the whole person. There's all kinds of issues that happen in assessment. So let's think about characterizing attributes. So tests then are circumstances designed to make assessment inferences. There's specific circumstances that we've set up to control the environment to get the inferences. So in a lot of our work, Kristen DeSerbo and I have been talking about the idea of the world being in two phases. Phase one is the world of instrumenting and collecting data. So the students going along, we talked about this the last few days, the students going along in their life, learning and doing fun things. Maybe they're having all the great joy of working with Bill and his collaborative. But then we have to stop them and instrument them to collect the data. That's what the test is. We've stopped the daily practice to instrument the situation to collect the data. So the purpose of the activity is data collection, so we can make inferences. So let's be really clear about that. And if you're data, you're really sad because that's a digital desert. There's not a lot of data, it's hard to get, it's locally the meaning is local, and that's why we have all these side effects that we're talking about. We have to stop kids, we have to standardize all this. Why? Because the goal is to collect standardized data. But the world is changing. And what's happening is daily activity is more and more naturally generating data. And so the potential for a paradigm shift in assessment is from stop, instrument, and collect to understand where it's being generated in the natural learning process, which isn't everywhere right now, but is going in that direction in many ways, and to capture the data rather than stopping and instrumenting on the student. I meant to say in my introductory remarks that most of my work I am at Pearson. I'm not in the large-scale testing part of Pearson. I'm in the curriculum and software part of Pearson, and most of my work is in higher education. I've worked in other areas as well. But here, for example, you can think of when you take a college math course now, very often you have lots of time where you're doing your homework online and putting the answers in online. That's a good example of the kind of thing where I'm talking about, where the natural activity of the homework generates the data. The generation of the data, the learning activity, is the same as the data generating activity. We call this the digital ocean because the analogy of both swimming in more and more data, but also the idea that there's different kinds of data, that data can be connected in different ways, that we can have different kinds of activities around that data. And as we go into this idea of testing versus assessment more writ large, we also think about new ways of that, what Bob said, evidence-bearing opportunities. If we think about the test as context for setting evidence-bearing opportunities versus what can we get out of capture and collect and naturally evidence-bearing opportunities, then we could think about this idea of, well, how have we approached tests versus what's the possibility from activities? And so Krista and I have argued that we should be thinking about activity as the container for evidence-bearing activity. And when you do that, you can kind of move a little bit away from this idea of I have to do this small thing because I'm collecting a specific amount of data. And so we talk about shift from the item paradigm to the activity paradigm, from posing very specific questions to getting activities that are more broad, from having specific answers to interpreting specific features, from indicating specific correctness, yes or no, to moving to a place where there's attributes about the performances, and from being highly focused because of the delivery system to using the more natural class-based activities. And this aligns with the idea that we have new forms of data in the wild, new forms of experience lead to new data, lead to new inferences. And so the idea is that the ability to capture data from everyday events should change how we think about learning and assessment. It's not so distinct between the learning world and the assessment world when the data, when the natural activity is itself evidence-bearing. And then we have dancing goats. I think it's really important that we have dancing goats in a presentation at the Academy. So let me just tell a story about this goat. This is the goat in the BBC typing software, and it had a big influence on my family because my daughter would leave her very cool Montessori school where she had all kinds of hippie stuff like farms and all kinds of stuff like that, and she would rush home to get online to do the BBC typing program. And she would type, and then she'd reach a certain level in that typing, and then the goat would dance. And then she'd type some more, and then and then it would dance. And that's how she learned typing. And it was completely disconnected from the school, but it had the opportunity of fun. It was fun for her. It had feedback, it had assessment, it had learning, it had all that stuff built in, and it was out of school. And we always thought, well, what if that program could send the data to her Montessori school that didn't teach typing and say, here's Grace's typing level. And then that way we'd be connecting the data of what's happening outside of school with other kinds of profiles. It would have to, of course, be all socially appropriate, be something we would want to do. It would have to be collected in the right way, used the right way. But that's how we started to think of this idea of the digital ocean. We have all these packets of different data because the data has started from testing rather than the natural activity that can provide evidence as we want and be shared. So this raises the question, like, is it curriculum or is it assessment? Is it game or is it instruction? Is it a game or is it assessment? Is it formal or is it informal? Is it schooling or education? These constructs are largely pre-digital constructs because of buildings and because of places, and they're all going to be rethought as we move forward here. Now, some people are summificating or accountabilizing this already. You're thinking like, how is this going to work in large-scale testing? Well, it's not. That would totally kill it. If I said to Grace, hey, you can only eat if you can do this many words a minute, and then the dancing goat's gonna bonk you. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a world of learning that shares its data as evidence-bearing opportunities rather than the other way around. So we just said that again, some of my favorite authors. A world in which data are a side effect, not the primary goal of interesting and motivating activity, and perhaps a world where testing is a rare event, but assessment is in the water. I know it's aspirational, doesn't work that way right now. It's a vision for the future. So when we think about the evolution of these different kinds of technologies and how we use technology in assessment, we think about 4 different levels. The most simple level is we basically reform old print conceptualizations, pre-digital conceptualizations in a digital space. So for instance, if I have a matching item in print and then I make it a matching item through drag and drop, we haven't made a huge progress there other than efficiency of collecting and moving the data, but we haven't changed the fundamental thing that we're doing in our interactions. And we've been doing a lot of that for a long time and a lot of validity studies about whether that works, and we gotta move on past that at some point. The next opportunity is, can we create new activities that provide novel and important performances? And this is a lot of the work that's happened in simulation and game-based assessment. But then we want to go beyond that, because those first 2 things are TEA, technology-enhanced assessment. But we want to go to the next level as we get these more richer and complex environments like homework systems that we use for the entire semester long. Can we create a system of extended assessment ecosystem that's not just a thing here and a thing here and a thing here, but a coherent system of inference and a coherent system of activity and potentially data collection? And then last, can we have all the dancing goats share their data with all the right agents? And that's what this level 4 is, integration of information over multiple systems and extended timeframes. So I just want to say something about simulation and game-based assessment. In the paper, we talk about it in terms of this idea of inferential distance. It's a concept that we haven't put that label on, but it's some of what's been discussed in the meeting here. This idea that the task and the activity that I want the person to actually learn and do, and the activity I actually want to see them do in the world, how much inferential machinery do I need? How much work on the claims and warrants do I need to say, well, when they do this thing, I can make the claim that they can do that thing? And part of what's happening in simulation and game-based assessment is we're trying to close that by making the learning and experiencing situation more similar to the inferential situation. I have to say, this whole idea of generalization over kind of topologies of cognitive or behavioral difference is something we don't talk very much about in assessment. We just have this idea of an inferential leap. But I think we need to continue to talk more and more about what's that, how far and in what ways and in what dimensions do we have those differences. And let me also say that there's lots of challenges in all this. It's complicated, it's hard work. A lot of this has been done with ECD. Some of these examples here have been done with ECD. It's hard because it's very easy just to pop a game up and to have certain kinds of things, but if you want specific attributes, that takes a lot more work. Let me jump to this slide and just say that there is some more recent work going on in what's the evidence for ongoing assessment, the evidence for simulation and game-based assessment, and sometimes we have some good progress. In other areas, it's very nascent and still a lot of work to go on there. But I think it's a fabulous area, and the progress has been tremendous in the last few years. We also talk a little bit about the generalized idea of that in terms of auto-scoring and a range of different kinds of activities. This is an example we give in the paper from Peter Foltz's work about automated scoring of essays. And you have to remember here that sometimes we say that it's automated scoring of essays, but it's really automated scoring of someone's thinking and writing performance. It's about what's being thought and how it's being expressed. A huge amount of work has gone on in this area in the last few years. The progress is tremendous. It's not perfect, but it's really great. And in these areas, what we want to think about is what are the kind of cost benefits in terms of the learning situation. So in general, we're doing this in higher ed, and in general, we're doing it in a way where we, in the curriculum case, encourage lots of practice where you might have automated feedback, but not ever 100% automated feedback. You want the human in the loop as well. So let me just say about the machine learning and this kind of activity, and I think we didn't say too much about machine learning in the paper, a couple pages maybe, but I think we might want to say some more. But in this example, for instance, which is associated with Peter's work, the automated scoring is actually more highly correlated with the average human than humans are amongst themselves. The technological advances here continue to grow, and there's great work. You're going to see an explosion of this in the years ahead, and that's why as I'm sitting around thinking, this is going to be really big. We need to spend a little bit more time on it in the paper. There are issues, of course. You've got to make sure it's appropriate for instruction. Sometimes the machine learning stuff is not highly explainable, and so that's a challenge. We also see times where we get people very good at machine learning and very bad at education, and we need to close that gap. And then there's also the possibility that the machine is learning bias in original scoring, and then you're taking that and automating. And there's a great book called Weapons of Math Destruction that talks about that idea. So a couple truths. This is kind of the caveats. I love making big, complicated, cool software, but the big issue is if you're doing personalized learning software and a teacher wants everyone to progress at the same time, it's not going to fit. Okay, so the ecosystem fit is huge. A lot of times we have these ideas about what would be great because of research, but the pragmatics in the classroom. Cost is still an issue in many places for creating complex environments. I talked about the risk profile and how different kinds of contexts we need to think about how we embed the software differently. Let me say one sentence or two about is learning environments, assessment, always low stakes. I always hear summative, end of the year, it's high stakes, could be graduation, so on. I have to say, when you have a student that's in his last year of high school, he or she is in their last year of high school, they may or may not pass that last class, that may or may not get them graduated. To me, that's high stakes too. We need to have the assessment right in that semester-long class. That's high stakes for that student at that time. And last, technology is changing faster than societal absorption, both technologically and socially. I mean, look at the phones. If you have children that have been teenagers in the last 10 years, all the parents are trying to figure out what just happened because they're doing all these behaviors we never imagined because they have all this access to friends and other kinds of information we never imagined. We're not absorbing it. Technologically, schools do not have the networking infrastructure largely to absorb these technologies. Last slide, rethink how technology allows for data as a side effect, not the primary purpose. Think about learning and assessment ecosystems, not individual events. And we're definitely behind in integrating data sciences and the learning sciences. And thank you. Oh, you know what? Let me just say one last thing. I'm sorry. There's a couple times we talked about differential, D&I, what's the D? Diversity and fairness. In curriculum, we also have diversity and inclusion. And so we're going to have to keep an eye on that. When you make a simulation, There's one issue about fairness. Is everyone equally learning? But there's also inclusion. Are all the appropriate kind of members of the community represented in that game, in that environment, and so on? So we need to keep the curricular as well as the assessment issues around diversity top of mind in these new integrated worlds.
I changed everything now, John. I have to redo this whole thing. Got it. My name is Katie Culp. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the New York Hall of Science. So I'm a representative from about as close to the world of practice, maybe, as some of us have in the room. John is sort of a friend from a distant planet. We work in very different environments and thinking about learning and assessing learning. And so I'm going to try to sort of embrace that and also embrace the idea that this session is about the future of assessment and unpack some of the ideas that John's and his colleagues' article made me think about. To start off, the article is clear and coherent and leads a non-expert through extremely complex ideas in really elegant ways. It may still have a few places where it says citations to come, but I think you can handle that. So the paper is a pleasure as a educational tool for folks working in very different environments. I agree that the machine learning piece probably needs to get expanded on because it's a piece that is so opaque for many of your audiences and so important. So I just wanted to raise a couple of broad areas that were things that I was curious to hear more about in the paper, and then unpack why those were important to me with in relation to a few images that I have from my own work. So the first was simply the broad category of assessment. I appreciate you pulling us away from testing. I think I can manage to not use the word testing for the rest of this. But you didn't, the paper doesn't really unpack assessment for what purpose. It's very broad on that level. For the purposes of my response, I'm going to be thinking about these issues in relation to informing classroom instruction and classroom situations. If we're thinking about these assessments in more of monitoring or selection and placement kinds of purposes, I sort of question the purpose of this much effort being put into assessment to accomplish ends that we've accomplished sort of not very well and to not very good end anyway for a long time. And I'd rather see the push toward addressing where assessment can really be most relevant in kids' own experiences. There's a sort of passing mention made in some of the chapter about the notion of what can be computationally measured. That kind of seems like the nut to me. From a teaching perspective, I think most teachers, and we've talked about the sociocultural context of learning today and yesterday, that who a child is as a learner is a much broader category than their fraction learning ability or where they are on that particular learning progression. If you guys could do me a favor and make sure that we're done making games to teach fractions, could we be done with that? I get it, fractions are a nice progression. We know a lot about how to teach them. It's a great test case for games for assessment. I'd really love to move on to some other things. But this notion of what the constraints are that you're placing on yourself by considering what can be computationally modeled is one that I frankly don't have the expertise to assess, but I'm really curious about. And then the broad piece, which is the piece I want to talk about the most, is I kind of want to go along with you in embracing AI and machine learning are going to affect education. I might have mixed feelings about that. I might have a lot of questions about that and concerns about that. I'm pretty sure it's going to happen. So for the purposes of this response, I want to sort of run with that. And what it makes me want to question is if one way or another where we want to get to is casting a much broader net in assessment and using data collection opportunities to capture a much richer picture of students' activities, what does it really mean for what we understand the definition of a student to be, and where that role as student fits in the broader identity of a whole child and a child's location in a community and the relationship between that community and their schools. So I want to talk about those in relation to two particular cases. You know what, I'm going to take my shoes off, they really hurt, sorry. And I want to use these examples intentionally to really push on the direction that these kinds of assessment might be taking. So I acknowledge these are not current urgent problems in assessment or things that are sort of in the picture for assessment today, even in models like the ones you're pushing toward. So the first example is something that happens all the time at our museum. So we have a large engineering design area, and it's an area where we really stress one of the things that's most important to us, which is giving kids opportunities to really experience what Bill was talking about, which is their agency as knowers, as reasoners, as actors on their community, because that's really central to your ability to become a scientifically literate person. And there's an area that's probably one of the simplest exhibits that we have. A lot of science museums have it, which is an area where kids can work with these little blocks. Anybody know what Kaplan blocks are? You guys probably know what Kaplan blocks are. So they're little bigger than a stick of gum, and the surfaces are brushed so that they have a certain amount of friction with each other, which makes them really, really good for building. So any given day during field trip time, you can see kids down there at this table. There are a couple thousand of these blocks. Kids working together, spontaneously building on each other's projects, building incredibly complex structures with these tools, often sitting there for half an hour, 45 minutes. It's a classic example of play as hard work, right? These are kids that are rehearsing and developing skills and experiences that are really going to become a basis for their thinking about more formal versions of the things that they're encountering in that situation. So something you can also run into almost every day is teachers saying, that kid there, that kid that built that thing that you can see there, I can't get him to pay attention to something for 5 minutes in class, right? That kid's presence in that community, in the setting that they're in, outside of their school identity, is a place where they can express a much more complex and much more persistent model of who they might be as a learner. And teachers are often really eager to get to capture that image. So the question for me is, can we imagine a way in the kinds of systems you're imagining that it's easy enough for a teacher to capture an image of that, right, to capture some of that process for the teacher to comment on it? Can you imagine a way that that kind of image of that child's more complex life outside of the school system could be represented and used as a point of reference for that longer learning progression and support assessment as a support for longer-term instruction and something that teachers can tap into and draw on over time. My other example is sort of at the other end of the spectrum, which is much older kids. I wanted to stress a younger kid because, just to stick with that for one more moment, I think often in assessment, I feel like we're not thinking very carefully about the needs and requirements of younger kids in terms of their literacy, their ability, the trade-offs are involved if we have them involved in a lot of digital experiences when they have a really strong need to also build up those material experiences of the world. And with teenagers, as you said, it's different. These are kids that many of them are deeply engaged in communities online and building expertise online. And the example I want to use from the community we work in, Nasir is in the middle of one of the largest recent immigrant Latino communities in the country. And many undocumented people, many people who are feeling very vulnerable and at risk in the current political situation. And probably if you could really see into the lives of a lot of the teenagers in that community, some of the most active work and most meaningful work that they've done in the last year is their own political activism around immigration issues in New York City. These are kids that are active in social media, who are building their own expertise, doing research online, building their understanding of how their life is being directly impacted by national policy. So my question is, if we are serious about the desire to capture that broader picture of kids' experiences, how do we account for, particularly as kids get older, the fact that their choices of what they choose to share with the school as a state-structured organization is something that they may want to hold themselves outside of? So my question is, how do we negotiate through a place where there may be a collision between our desire to represent and embrace the complexity of kids' lives in our assessment practices, but there probably should be boundaries on that, and how do we negotiate that, and how do we hand over to kids the opportunity for them to be the ones, maybe, turning that switch to oversimplify on what they choose to share with their school community and what they hold outside of that school community. So, in summary, the opportunity, I think, that you and your colleagues are holding out is to create assessment experiences that capture a much broader picture of the complexity of kids' lives in the sociocultural context that they live in. But if we're going to do that, we're also going to really have to open up a public conversation about how we reimagine and renegotiate the boundaries between the processes of schooling and the monitoring capacities of schooling. And that we really need to find ways to put minors, students, as whole children who have rights to privacy, rights to self-determination, to let them be at the center of that discussion. Thank you. I'm going to put my shoes back on. Sure.
Rich, come up. Here's the microphone. Oh, okay. The advertisement. So we have time now for questions and comments from the audience for Bill and Rich and John and Katie. So I'll throw it open. Yeah, Henry.
Thanks. Very interesting presentations and discussion. And Bill, I was intrigued by some of the issues and data that you generated regarding teachers and how some of them didn't see the value of some of the data collection activities that you were hoping. And I'm wondering, how does all of this, and I would include some of the work that Bob described earlier, how does this or how should this affect teacher training? And have you had any conversations with folks who are involved in teacher development, not just teacher professional development, but sort of the next generation? How might this affect teacher training, and so that over the next couple of generations we have a teacher force that is more attuned to some of the issues that you've raised and some of the alternative views of student learning than is perhaps typical in teacher training today?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, I am involved in doing teacher development at the School of Ed and at CU through our Learning Sciences program. And one of the things that we emphasize in our classrooms is this kind of relational stance of teachers towards students, that building a positive relationship with your students and understanding the funds of knowledge and interests that they bring is actually one of the tasks of teaching, right? So, and that's the perspective that we're able to bring as learning sciences while they're in their science ed classes learning about science methods. We're sort of saying, how does this, what can this look like inside the subject matter? And that's important to us, as Lori said. This is not just building relationships so we find out what your hobbies are, but some of the hobbies are very relevant and bring relevant knowledge to the phenomenon that we're studying. So part of what I do in some of my classes, is actually what's a practical way to, like we generated, for example, the end of semester last that I taught on adolescent development for teachers. What are some range of strategies that you can develop for learning about your kids' interests, but in relationship to this standard that you have to teach? And so, how can we do that in a way that's efficient? Because you can't, do an ethnography, of every kid's family.
Rick?
So I think this is the time when I introduced the idea that I didn't understand about 3/4 of what was said this morning, because I'm of a different tribe, and all of you were speaking to your own tribe. And I think the main thing I didn't understand throughout all these discussions is why you were doing assessments. What was the purpose of them? Now, some of it was embedded in trying to develop the next set of questions and so on and get the curriculum better, but there are other purposes of these. And so my suggestion, rather than try to bring me up to speed for what I didn't understand this morning, my suggestion is that in each of your papers, you have a very clear statement about why you're doing this stuff and how the structure you have relates. Because, I hear John say, well, we can generate a lot of data. okay? I hear Bill saying, well, the last thing we want is anybody outside of the classroom to use this information for any other purpose. And so there are limits and boundaries that I just frankly didn't understand at all.
Which of you wants to talk to that?
Well, I think you told us to make sure we're clear on what we're doing in the papers. I didn't hear a question.
Well, I wanted to take issue, Rick, with your characterization of what I said. We actually do make use of these data as a partnership. What I said, I think I make a distinction between a research practice partnership using evidence to inform its activities and a school district accountability system taking hold of data and making use of it in ways that we didn't intend. So I just want to clarify that because I did not say at all that, yeah, okay.
Say, ask it a little bit differently. How would the school district, your DPS superintendent, how should he be evaluating teachers? And does anything you're doing come into evaluating the teachers in DPS?
Yeah, so I can answer that question because I mentioned the SLO process. One of the things that we do in a partnership is try to really hook into but also shape the what Jim Spillane and Megan Hopkins call the instructional guidance infrastructure that exists in every school district, which is increasingly complex. They get lots of forms of guidance to people. So we try to articulate with that so that teachers don't get in trouble for trying out our curriculum. But more to the point, we also try to shape it and say, you know, you should be looking for these kinds of things in a science classroom that are not on your subject matter independent, neutral observation scheme. And we work, Douglas, my co-author, works with assistant superintendents and people who do observations and goes into classrooms with them to help literally guide their seeing, you know.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, you know, I had that slide that said, try not to accountabilize the process, which is taking a process intended to support learning in the classroom and use it for an accountability process. So I'm very concerned about that. I'm not saying you shouldn't have those other processes, you just need to be clear which ones you're using. At the same time, I think historically we've had this evolution where we started with accountability tests, and there's a lot of money in accountability tests, there's a lot of political emphasis around that. Part of what I'm also saying, and we're saying in the paper, is are there opportunities for using the other data in the classroom as the classroom changes and other experiences change, in the same way that my health behavior is being changed by my Apple Watch. You know, it doesn't change what the doctor does when I go see the doctor for my accountability test, but do we have a similar metaphor going on in education that's evolving?
Sorry, that might lead away from that discussion. But the question I have is for John, because I mean, so besides being a physics education person, I'm an assessment person as well. So I always love these things, right? And I get totally excited about like, hey, cool, game-based assessment. Every time I read about it, I get all excited about it. Then I present about this idea, and then people say, well, what about the ethics of it? And I think this is something that I think is really important. I'm not sure you have it in your paper. But the question that people are asking me and that I'm asking myself is, how do we, you know, I mean, we're collecting all this data, and then we're making claims or inferences from this data about students learning. But students might behave differently if they know it's an assessment or if they know it's not an assessment, or they don't know that it's an assessment, right? So, I mean, assume that they're just doodling around, and then we're like, oh, that student doesn't get it. And we're, you know, like trying to help them learn something that they already know. How is that gonna affect their learning, their future learning, their motivation to learn, and so on. And I think that's really, I mean, I love this idea of, you know, like game-based assessment, but I wonder if we tell them it's an assessment, it's gonna destroy the effect of it. And if we don't tell them,
Well,
we're having
remember-
all kinds
well-
of validity issues.
Right, so let's go back to the assessment versus test thing. If it's a test, and that's the purpose, is to set up a situation, that's the purpose, then that's different from the assessment where we're going to take the data and use it in a way that they've already agreed to, and it's just part of the ecosystem. You know, one of the things that's very interesting about how assessment works in the physical world is there's all these cues that happen. You know, a quiz has a certain meaning. On Friday, we're going to have a quiz. Well, you know, Ms. McGillicuddy, what does a quiz mean to you? Does that mean it's going to count, or is it not going to count? Can I take it again? All that stuff is negotiated in the physical world. And as we have new genres of experience, we're going to have to figure out what those social cues are and how we communicate them and how we negotiate them. But we have all that already, you know, in our learning ecosystems, but they're just not always made explicit. And I think that's also an issue where some families or kids know how to figure it out and others don't, and some are disadvantaged because of it. So we'll have to learn how to negotiate those. But it also, from a research perspective, I think sheds light on current practice that is sometimes hidden.
You know, I think this discussion brings up the sort of distinction between what I'd call low stakes versus high stakes game situations. But I was also thinking about this in the context of an analogy that when Randy Bennett and I were talking about this in terms of the you know, digital world, which is, and I think this speaks to somewhat your point, Knut. Oftentimes in learning spaces, kids are exploring, and we want them to explore. In fact, one of the things we know in the learning sciences that said, you know, part of the things you need is you learn from failure when you get feedback, because and failure is actually useful to move you along, so long as it's not completely outside your realm and punitive. So it's the sort of the distinction between, and I think you're saying this, what are the cues as to sort of when it's low stakes, when am I in a learning mode, and when am I in a performance mode? So the example I use is, you know, somebody who's in sports, you know, a baseball player, when they're in the batting cage, they're working on their swing. Okay, they don't want to be evaluated then. They want to actually figure out, okay, how do I work on my swing, get better, or you know, you're on the practice tee in golf. And then you sort of say, okay, now keep score. I'm in the game. You're keeping my batting average, or you know, we're scoring. You know, we're scoring. You know, what you do on the course, and that's a very important distinction, because we don't want to suppress people. You know, have the opportunity to explore and learn, because they constantly feel like Big Brother's watching you. And I think this is what you're talking about, is negotiating that space. Because I think it was a little bit also what you were bringing up, Katie, as well, which is when do you you know, sort of say, okay, I'm willing to share with you, but I'm sharing under these circumstances.
You know, or maybe they don't share. Maybe it's just for their own personal, you know, portfolio that's not shared with anybody. Yeah. Sorry.
And just the only thing I would add is, that batter in the batting cage is really good at practicing, right? And I think to a teacher and for a student as well, seeing evidence of being good at practicing or being good at exploring, knowing how to reflect on your own experience, modify what you're doing, again, in the kinds of activities I was talking about that happen at the hall, you see that. Just the other day, I said, 6 or 7 girls were building sort of these larger scale building things. And I watched them for a while, and I said to their teacher, they're really good. They're negotiating this together. They're doing a great job, like sorting this out and deciding how they're going to do it. And she said, yeah, we work really hard on that. And so she's there seeing this evidence. And so in her own informal assessment, that's something that she's recognizing. So sorry, I went on too long. But I think that itself is also important, formative assessment information.
Michael?
We don't succeed in developing the equivalent of a unified field theory for a single system of assessment that accomplishes the goals of system monitoring, accountability, and useful classroom-based instructional improvement. I'm just thinking of my own life expectancy here. Others may have a different sense of longevity, but in the event that it will happen after my, this chapter ends for me, I'm curious about, I have two questions for the group. Maybe this is a way to tee up the next part of the conference, but the first question is, so suppose we just accepted that there is a bit of a clash of cultures, or at least a not necessarily compatible set of purposes for using assessment. Can we imagine going forward recognizing that there is likely to be some corruption of either of those goals because we have two systems going in parallel, and just accepting that and saying, okay, in spite of that imperfection, we still want to do this because the kind of stuff that you guys are describing at the classroom level can really be helpful, useful, interesting, stimulating, motivating, et cetera. And the kind of stuff that, just for lack of a better metaphor, that NAEP is still about, has its useful purposes. And to the extent that they won't ever really be one single system, we should continue to recognize that that they both have uses in our society. So that's the first question. The second is, I'm just wondering about the extent to which, in both of those cultures of assessment, there is an embedded idea that measurement actually is intended to influence behavior and not just describe it or even try to explain it. And I'm very impressed that in the last day and a half, no one has mentioned Campbell's Law, which is all about, essentially, if I get it right, what happens when systems of measurement are actually used to try to influence or alter behavior. Not so much, and there's a two-part, at least two strands off of that. One is, do we feel confident in what it is we're trying to change enough to impose it? And second, do we think that by using measures in that way, we aren't corrupting their own meaning, validity, reliability, or other things? So could you take that on, and then we'll break for lunch?
Well, I think it really gets back to use. And again, maybe this is an important point for the paper to untangle that a little bit more, the variety of uses. And I think, I think the whole slide where we just got to be honest with ourselves. Is this really about assessment, or is this about large-scale accountability testing? Because I go to many of these things, and they say they're about assessment, and then it always starts from the assumption, okay, well, the real thing is like large-scale accountability testing, but we'll have these other conversations because they're kind of interesting. Is that we got to be clear, like, are we doing learning where assessment helps? Are we doing accountability where assessment's the mechanism? And or are we going to do something in the middle? And again, from my perspective, I think Peter and R's perspective, there's new experiences, there's new possibilities. Let's have the conversation about how we can use those to promote learning and dialogue. Just because you have an assessment result or a game result doesn't mean you can't sit down and have a dialogue about it as a classroom activity, or bring it home, or you didn't collaborate well in your game, why don't you talk to your mom about it? I'm not going to put it on your transcript, but maybe it's a place for a dialogue.
I think I would say, Michael, that the two cultures might be separate in this room, but they're commingled every day in classrooms, schools, and districts. And so this is a point that Lori and Jim and I make in a paper earlier this year, is that a district is probably a really good laboratory and a long-term partnership between people with expertise in curriculum assessment to explore ways that these can be coherent, come together and not come together in the appropriate places, you know. So I think we could learn a lot from groups like, you know, Data and Society that are thinking hard about the privacy, like where do we want things connected, where do we not want things connected. But we need living laboratories to work these things out. We're not going to work it out as intellectual communities working within our fields, I would argue.
Let me just say one other thing, is I think it's very interesting. A lot of these startups, there's, you know, all this startup in the ed tech space, and sometimes they're reinventing assessment. And there's huge, you know, amazing work done in the theory of it, like what Bob talked about, and computationally. And there's a lot of that has been funded and oriented toward large scale, and has a lot of benefit actually in online. So I think there's a lot of rich community dialogues we can have, but it's really important. And before, I didn't mean to say that those, you know, the accountability tests, you know, aren't important for their purposes. I just think we always start with, that's the starting place in a way, and I think we might want to get back to the earlier discussion, be clear about what the assumptions are in the dialogues.
You know, we always make choices in education, even if they're subterranean. And I don't think you can have rich forms of mathematics and science without opening up the learning space. And so that means we don't really have a choice. We really have to think hard about assessments that can inform instruction. And I think that to date, I think Bill's point is right on mark. We need pragmatic context in which we can look at these trade-offs, because these are, of course, political as well as learning decisions. And we need experience in how to talk across this chasm, because right now, what happens in most districts is you can have some fun and games, but the ultimate arbiter is the standardized assessment. It turns out that if you actually help children learn mathematics and science, they'll do just fine on those standardized assessments. In fact, they'll usually increase. What we are mystified by is exactly why.
Scott?
This is the world that I live in every day, Michael. Pass this over to oh, sorry. Hold on, Scott.
Knowing Scott as I do, we don't want to miss one syllable.
So I think we're talking about the assessments, but we have to recognize that accountability systems are designed to change behavior, and purposely. So our hope is thinking about ways that we can change the accountability policies instead of trying to assume the accountability policies are fixed, and we have to somehow make this magic bridge of these assessments designed to do different things. Because in most cases, if in fact the accountability tests are high enough pressure, if the accountability system has enough consequences, that schools are going to find ways to react. And if they don't have the skills to do what Rich just said, to say, okay, we'll teach deeply because we know enough that we're still going to perform well, then they're going to find other ways that are, you know, Elmore's written about this, lots of folks have written about this, they're going to find less useful ways and shortcuts to try to get themselves so that they survive the accountability system and, you know, take no prisoners. So that's the problem. And I think that's some of the hope that we're working with, trying to work on the policy end, because as long as, it doesn't matter almost what assessment we put in place as the large-scale assessment, even if it's, you know, as good tasks and rich thinking called for, but as long as we ratchet up that policy, then people are going to react in ways that we hope that they don't.
And I think that after lunch, our policy folks are going to solve all these problems. They're going to tell us how to bridge the gap between the world of one form of assessment and the world of the classroom. But I think there's actually another thing that hasn't really been it sort of sits under the below the surface here, which is the kinds of things you've been talking about at the classroom level, and Lori, are a reflection of the standards that we now have. They're a reflection of what we've learned and what we value about the kind of mathematics and science and literacies we want developed in schools. And so ultimately, the large-scale assessments have to somehow better align with those things. And so what we have is we have things out of sync in terms of time and capacity, and somehow we will always be playing this little bit of catch-up. But I do think it's not complete. They're not completely incommensurate, because in fact one is supposed to reflect. Both are supposed to reflect the same set of goals. It's just the ways in which we go about that, and the efficacy with which, and the validity with which we can draw the inferences. And then, as you're pointing out, what we do with those data.
Ratchet up the pressure of saying it doesn't matter how good that assessment is.
Well, yeah, there was, but he just said it. There's Campbell's law that operates that, you know. So with that, let's. Yes, we do have to break for lunch, but I'll let Mike have a last shot. Oh, I'm sorry,
Yep,
Judy.
I've got the last shot.
Now that we've provoked people sufficiently.
So I have a question about the dog that didn't bark. So we've been here for a day and a half, and no one has mentioned anything about online learning and assessment in the context of online learning. And certainly at my institution, so this is not my research side, but administrative side, online learning and the role of online learning in higher education, which is going to filter down to K-12 rather quickly, as well as the role of computer scientists. I mean, some people have mentioned machine learning and AI, but the role of computer scientists who don't know anything about what was just discussed over the last day and a half, but they believe that they can build it better than anybody in this room with the expertise. So I'm thinking about the forward-looking part of this volume, and maybe this is not the right panel, but it's sort of the ultimate or the penultimate panel, that to not have that somewhere in the mix seems to be looking backwards and not looking forwards. So just welcome people's thoughts on it.
I think that's part of what you're talking about, John, which is really where some of that digital ocean comes from. It's actually in those environments. It's interesting that you now work primarily in the world of higher ed than in the K-12 world.
Well, you know, the install base for technology is so much higher in higher ed. You know, it's just, that's where people are active. And to Judy's point, that's where people are active in digital environments and education right now.
Michael, and then we'll break for lunch. I don't want to get us behind again.
But I think that's another kind of fundamental assumption that happens in some of these conversations. They tend to, you know, focus on K-12 without anybody ever saying this is a K-12 discussion. In the same way they focus on high stakes without saying it's a high stakes discussion. Yeah.
Well, there's also just another dimension to this, which is, I think, important. In some ways, some of us have seen that it's easier to impact or transform some things in higher ed because there's greater local control than it is in the situation of K-12 because of all the other forces that are operating.
Yeah.
So there's a different set of policy dynamics as well as ownership there.
Right.
Yeah, I just have two comments and then a question. The first one is that 2 days ago, first comment is that 2 days ago, an advocacy group in New Jersey called Jersey Can succeeded in halting a vote by the State Board of Education to reduce the amount of testing in high schools. The governor had proposed to reduce the number of tests down to 2, and the minimum required by the U.S. Department of Education. And this advocacy group is celebrating having halted that vote. Now, it's going to come back up. So what I think part of what you're describing is a tension that is going to be faced by more states across the country as they try to make decisions about which test to use, when, and how much testing to do, and how much is necessary. The second comment that I would make is that there is a lesson, perhaps from post-secondary education assessment. Yesterday, Henry asked about if my paper included the outcomes assessment issues, and I'll only mention them and then leave them for later because of the focus on admissions. But in the state of Tennessee, in performance funding, there are some assessment requirements, and the state has reached an agreement with institutions on conditions in which they might not require specific assessments. The main condition is that the assessment doesn't tell them anything different. So you administer it year after year. It's not a requirement for individuals, but for institutions, more of the accountability. If you're doing this to make sure that each individual achieves, it's a different question. But in the case of performance funding, the issue is whether the university or the college is succeeding. And in exchange for that, the institution gets to do something different. So my question is are there a set of conditions that you would have for states or school districts to be able to select among the options that we've heard about in this conference and make decisions about assessments when in fact they've demonstrated that, you know, it's not going to help them to administer the same one or the mandatory one?
It's got an answer to that one, I'm not sure. Anybody in the audience has an answer to that one?
We were so successful at parking complex questions at the dinner, I suggest we park this one at lunch.
Lunch, I think so. I think we declare victory and have lunch.